Jason Fox was not just a name in the world of basketball. He was an icon. At the age of 22, he had already made a name for himself as one of the youngest and most promising stars in the NBA. His name was plastered across billboards, his face appeared on commercials, and his every move was followed by the media. Fans packed arenas not just to watch their favorite team play, but to see Jason dominate the court with his incredible athleticism, precision, and a smile that melted hearts. For most people, Jason's life seemed perfect. He had it all: wealth, fame, talent, and a future filled with endless possibilities. But behind the public persona, there was a side of Jason that no one knew about. Jason had been hiding a dangerous secret for years, a secret that could destroy everything he had worked for. It all started a few seasons back, when he was first introduced to a group of men in the shadows of professional sports. These men were part of an underground gambling ring, one that was deeply embedded in the world of sports. At first, Jason had no interest in becoming involved in something so dangerous, but the allure of money and power pulled him in. It wasn't long before he was lured into the world of match-fixing and illegal betting. What began as a way to make easy money soon turned into an addiction, a dangerous path that Jason couldn't seem to escape. The pressure of keeping this secret weighed heavily on Jason. He continued to play, continued to win, all while keeping up the facade of the perfect athlete. But the stress of living two lives, one in the public eye and one in the shadows, was taking its toll. He found solace in the arms of someone he thought he could trust, someone who wouldn't judge him for his mistakes. Her name was Emma Collins, a 19-year-old cheerleader for Jason's team. Emma was bright, cheerful, and full of life. She had dreams of becoming a professional dancer, and for a while, Jason allowed himself to think that he could have a normal relationship with her, away from the chaos of his double life. But it wasn't long before Emma began to notice things that didn't add up. She overheard conversations, pieced together details that Jason had tried to hide. Emma, out of curiosity, started to dig deeper. It was during one of these moments that she discovered something that would change everything: the gambling ring and Jason's involvement in fixing games. Emma, in her youthful naivety, thought she could handle this information. Halfway through the seminar, dancing with Jason, she was enthusiastic to play, and Jason found her behavior improved. Thought she could handle this information. She didn't realize how dangerous it was to know such a thing, especially when it involved someone as powerful as Jason. Jason had always been good at keeping his secrets, but Emma's discovery made him uneasy. He knew she would want to expose the truth, and the thought of his career being ruined terrified him. The fame he had worked so hard for, the respect he had gained from his teammates and fans, none of it would matter if the world found out the truth. Jason's mind began to race. He couldn't afford to let Emma speak. She had become a liability, and Jason knew the only way to protect himself was to make sure she stayed quiet. Forever. The more Jason thought about it, the more certain he became. He couldn't let Emma destroy everything he had built. The decision was made, and Jason knew that he had to act fast. There would be no turning back. The path he was about to take would lead him down a dark and twisted road, one where the stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced before. He had the world at his feet, but now he was willing to risk it all to keep his secret safe. As the snow fell, as the weeks went by, the pressure on Jason Fox continued to mount. Emma's curiosity had turned into suspicion, and she began to notice more of the strange patterns in Jason's behavior. He had been distant, distracted, and more secretive than ever. She couldn't help but wonder what was going on beneath the surface. But Jason was always quick with a reassuring smile or a tender gesture to keep her at ease. Her console was now called. However, Emma wasn't naive. She had always prided herself on being perceptive, and slowly the pieces began to fall into place. One night, after a particularly grueling game, Jason invited her to dinner. They sat at a quiet table in a corner of a dimly lit restaurant, and while they spoke about everything from their plans for the weekend to their favorite movies, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had noticed the odd looks exchanged between Jason and a few of his teammates, the hushed conversations whenever she entered the locker room, and the way Jason's phone was always locked with a password he refused to share. But it was one conversation, one slip-up, that changed everything. As Jason excused himself to take a call, Emma overheard fragments of the conversation. He was speaking in code, something she didn't understand at first, but one thing was clear. It wasn't just a friendly chat. The words money, game, and outcome stood out in the conversation. She strained to hear more, but Jason returned quickly, his face slightly flushed, as though he'd been caught in the act. He apologized, saying it was just business matters with a friend. But Emma's mind was already racing. The next day, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She had known that Jason was involved in something big, but she hadn't expected it to be something so sinister. With her heart pounding in her chest, she decided to dig deeper. She accessed Jason's laptop when he wasn't home, scrolling through files that had names she didn't recognize. She found what she was looking for: documents detailing suspicious transactions, numbers of large bets placed on games that had involved Jason's team. In locating the wrong deals, she slowed the process down and scrolled the screen to look for a few team names that had involved Jason's team. It was clear now. Jason had been using his position to manipulate the outcome of games, all to line his pockets with money from illegal betting. And Emma's stomach churned as she realized the depth of Jason's involvement. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Should she confront him, or should she keep quiet? But then the reality hit her. She could never be a part of this world. The truth had to come out. She couldn't live with the knowledge of what he had done and continue to pretend everything was fine. She spent the next few days in turmoil, grappling with the idea of revealing what she knew. She couldn't imagine exposing Jason to the world, especially given the consequences. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore her moral compass. This wasn't just about basketball. It was about integrity, about doing what was right. Emma confided in a close friend, someone she trusted deeply. She told her everything she had discovered, about the betting ring, the fixed games, and Jason's role in it all. Her friend was shocked, horrified by the extent of the corruption, but Emma knew she had to take action. As the days passed, Emma grew increasingly determined. She began gathering all the evidence she could: documents, messages, anything that could prove Jason's guilt. She knew the stakes were high, and if she was going to expose him, she had to be ready for the consequences. The more she thought about it, the more she felt the weight of the decision. But one thing was certain: the truth had to be told. The tension between them grew as Jason seemed to sense that Emma was keeping something from him. The way she would act distant, the long silences, and her lack of trust in him were becoming more apparent. Jason, too, began to feel the strain of the situation. He couldn't help but wonder if Emma had figured out the truth. The more she distanced herself, the more desperate Jason became to keep her in the dark. But Emma wasn't the type to back down from the truth. She had made up her mind. She would go to the authorities. She would make sure Jason faced the consequences of his actions. What she didn't know was that Jason was also preparing for what was to come, and he wouldn't let her destroy his carefully constructed life without a fight. As the tension between Jason and Emma escalated, so did the pressure on Jason. He could feel the walls closing in around him. Emma's distant behavior, the way she seemed preoccupied and lost in thought whenever they were together, had not gone unnoticed. He knew she was on to something, but he couldn't figure out how much she knew. He had tried to keep his composure, hoping that her suspicions would eventually fade. But deep down, Jason knew that Emma's resolve was growing stronger. It wasn't just the conversations or the documents she had stumbled upon that troubled him. It was the way Emma had started talking about the future, about how she felt torn between her loyalty to him and the weight of the truth. Her words had grown more cryptic, her silence more oppressive. Jason knew she was struggling with a decision that could destroy everything he had worked for. Emma had become a threat, one that could expose the very foundation of his carefully crafted life. One night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Jason's thoughts raced. He had always been good at thinking on his feet, but this time he couldn't see a way out. The idea of losing his career, his fame, and everything he had built was unbearable. He had worked too hard to let it all slip away because of a mistake he had made years ago. Jason had always been able to control the narrative, to manipulate situations in his favor, but this time it wasn't working. The truth was getting closer, and Emma was the key to revealing it. Jason spent the next few days trying to figure out how to deal with the situation. He knew he couldn't let Emma go public with what she knew. The stakes were too high. The media would destroy him, and the authorities would tear apart everything he had been hiding. He had to act fast. He needed to stop Emma before she could do any more damage. He began to formulate a plan, one that would ensure Emma couldn't expose him. It had to be quick, decisive, and most importantly, it had to leave no traces. Jason couldn't afford to make a mistake. He knew how the police operated, and he couldn't risk leaving any evidence behind. The thought of going down for a crime he had committed in desperation was something he couldn't stomach. His mind turned darker as he thought about the only solution that could guarantee his secret stayed safe. It wasn't just about silencing Emma, it was about survival. Jason had worked his entire life to reach the top, and he wasn't about to let someone take it all away from him. The more he thought about it, the more clear it became. Emma had to be dealt with, and if it meant doing something drastic, so be it. The idea of eliminating her became more and more plausible. He had done things before that were morally questionable, but this was different. This was the ultimate betrayal. Yet, he couldn't let it stop him. The fear of losing everything had clouded his judgment, and the darker side of Jason Fox began to take control. The next day, Jason reached out to Emma. He invited her to meet him, under the guise of wanting to talk things through. He suggested a quiet, secluded spot outside the city where they could speak privately, away from the prying eyes of others. Emma, still torn between her growing suspicions and her lingering feelings for him, agreed. She had hoped that maybe Jason had realized the gravity of the situation and that they could resolve things peacefully. She had no idea that Jason's intentions were far more sinister. As the day approached, Jason felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew what he had to do, but the enormity of it made his hands shake. Yet he had no choice. Emma had become a threat, and in his mind there was no other way. He couldn't allow her to destroy everything he had worked for, no matter what it took. The lies, the manipulation, the cover-ups, it was all about to culminate in the darkest moment of Jason Fox's life. When Emma arrived at the meeting spot, she had no idea that it would be the last time she would ever meet Jason. The quiet park, surrounded by dense trees and the hum of the distant city, set the stage for a life-altering decision. Emma had no idea that the man she had trusted so deeply had already made up his mind. As Jason saw her approach, the weight of his decision bore down on him. There would be no turning back now. As Emma walked toward Jason, she felt a mix of anxiety and hope. The tension between them had reached its peak in recent weeks, but she still held on to the hope that they could find a way to salvage their relationship. Perhaps, she thought, this meeting would finally give them the closure they both needed. Maybe Jason had come to his senses. Maybe he was ready to tell her the truth about everything, the secrets he had been keeping, the lies he had woven. But deep down, A nagging feeling told her that something wasn't right. There was an unfamiliar coldness in his eyes, a certain detachment that sent a shiver down her spine. Jason watched her approach, his mind racing with what he had to do. He had already made the decision Emma had to be silenced. There was no room for second chances. He couldn't afford to let her expose him. As much as he hated to admit it, Emma was a liability, and in the world he had created, there was no room for mistakes. He had been careful to cover his tracks, but the truth was inching closer every day. Emma's growing suspicions and her quiet determination to reveal the truth made her dangerous. She had to go. They sat on a bench in the park, a place they had visited together before when everything had seemed normal, when life had been simpler. Emma sat slightly farther from him than usual, as if trying to gauge his mood. Jason, on the other hand, leaned forward, his hands clenched in his lap. He didn't know how to start. His mind was clouded with thoughts of what he had to do next, but he knew he had to keep up the appearance of calmness. If he acted nervous, she might catch on. He couldn't let her see the fear in his eyes. At first, the conversation was casual, awkward even. Emma tried to break the ice, asking about the upcoming games and the team's performance, but Jason's answers were short, disinterested. She could tell that something was off, that he wasn't fully engaged in the conversation. She pushed on, determined to find out what was bothering him, but Jason wasn't cooperating. Her gut told her that this wasn't a casual meeting anymore. This was different. Something had changed, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was in danger. Without warning, Jason stood up abruptly, his face hardening. Emma looked up at him, confused. But before she could say anything, he spoke in a low, tense voice. He told her that they needed to end things for good. His words were cold, as if they no longer mattered, as if the bond they once shared had been broken beyond repair. Emma's heart sank as she listened to him, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She had known things were strained, but this felt like the final blow. She tried to respond, to plead with him to talk things through. But Jason wasn't listening. As Jason walked away, Emma stood up, her thoughts racing. She could feel the unease growing inside her, the sense that she was in danger. Something was wrong and she could no longer ignore it. She started to back away, slowly trying to keep her distance from him. But just as she turned to leave, Jason grabbed her by the arm with a sudden force that caught her off guard. The grip was tight, unyielding. Emma tried to pull away, but he was stronger than she anticipated. Panic surged through her as she realized the situation was spiraling out of control. She struggled to free herself, but Jason was relentless. His eyes were cold, devoid of any emotion. In that moment, Emma understood that she was no longer dealing with the man she had once loved. This was someone else, someone capable of unimaginable cruelty. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to scream for help, but Jason's hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her. The struggle was brief but brutal. In a moment of desperate clarity, Emma realized that she was fighting for her life. She kicked, she clawed, but Jason's grip was too strong. Her vision blurred as she gasped for breath, the reality of the situation sinking in. Jason was determined to make sure she could never speak again. There was no way back for her now. When it was over, Jason stood over her lifeless body, his breath heavy in his chest. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic in the background. Emma was gone, and the secret Jason had been so desperate to protect remained safe for now. The weight of his actions settled in, but he pushed it down, burying it deep inside. He had done what he had to do. It was over. Emma would never speak of what she knew, and Jason could go back to living his life, pretending that everything was normal. But as he walked away from the scene, a chilling sense of dread began to creep in. He had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The days following Emma's disappearance were filled with a sense of uneasy calm, but Jason could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The story he had crafted for the media Emma had gone missing after a brief argument, possibly running away or being kidnapped seemed to be working at first. The police launched an investigation, but with no evidence of foul play, their efforts soon seemed to slow. Jason played the role of the concerned boyfriend, grieving, desperate for answers. He appeared on television, holding back tears as he pleaded for Emma's safe return. The public responded with sympathy, the media latching onto the heartbreaking narrative of the lost cheerleader and the troubled basketball star. It seemed like everything was falling into place for Jason. But underneath the surface, the pressure was mounting. Detective Miller, the lead investigator on the case, wasn't convinced. He had seen enough missing person cases in his career to know when something didn't add up. The timeline of events surrounding Emma's disappearance was too clean, too perfect, almost as if someone had carefully orchestrated it. Miller began to dig deeper into Jason's life, aware that the young athlete's polished image might be hiding a darker truth. There were whispers about Jason's past, rumors of gambling debts and shady associates, but nothing concrete that could tie him to Emma's disappearance. Yet there was something in his eyes, a certain nervous energy that Miller couldn't ignore. He was hiding something. The investigation into Emma's disappearance dragged on for weeks, with little progress. Jason continued to publicly mourn, always appearing composed, a tragic hero in the eyes of his fans. But inside he was spiraling. Every time the media mentioned Emma's name, every time someone brought up the case, his heart would race. He couldn't escape the weight of what he had done. The more the investigation lingered, the more Jason feared the truth would come to light. He had thought he could bury the secret and move on, but the longer Emma remained missing, the more cracks began to form in his carefully constructed life. Then the first break came. Detective Miller received an anonymous tip-off, a piece of information that could change everything. The caller didn't reveal their identity, but they knew things that only someone close to the case could have known. They spoke about the gambling ring Jason had been involved in, and the bets placed on games Jason's team had been part of. It was clear that the caller knew about Jason's dark past, his ties to illegal activities, and the detective knew he was on the right path. He began to push harder, following the lead wherever it took him. As Miller continued to gather evidence, the noose around Jason's neck tightened. There were whispers in the underground betting world, rumors about a basketball star who had gotten in too deep, who had resorted to more extreme measures to protect his secret. One night, Miller uncovered a piece of information that confirmed his suspicions, a phone record showing that Jason had been in constant contact with a number linked to a known member of the gambling syndicate. This was the break he had been waiting for. The investigation began to shift focus onto Jason, and it didn't take long for the media to catch wind of the new direction. The public, once so sympathetic to his plight, began to turn. As the details of his involvement in the betting ring emerged, fans were shocked by the revelations. The golden boy of basketball, the man who had captivated the world with his skill and charm, was now at the center of a growing scandal. The once admired athlete had become a suspect, and the investigation into Emma's disappearance took a darker turn. Jason, realizing that the walls were closing in, knew that the truth could no longer be hidden. As the detective's pressure mounted, he made a decision. He couldn't allow himself to be caught. In a moment of desperation, Jason made a plan to flee, to escape the consequences of his actions. He thought he could run far enough, high in a place where no one could find him. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The truth had already been set in motion, and no matter how far he ran, it would catch up with him eventually. As the day of his planned escape arrived, Jason found himself standing at a crossroads, the weight of his decisions crashing down on him. He had taken a life to protect his secret, but in doing so he had sealed his own fate. The truth would come out. The public, the media, and most importantly, the authorities were closing in. There would be no place for him to hide. His past had caught up with him, and the consequences of his actions would now unfold in the most inevitable of ways. What Jason didn't realize was that the investigation, led by Detective Miller, was already prepared to confront him. The truth once buried was now ready to surface, and there was no escaping the reckoning that awaited him.